This video is going to be introducing an exercise where we're going to be working with vector editors and primarily Illustrator in this video to develop UX, UI wireframes and then more finished UX, UI designs. So to give a little primer on UX and UI, so UX and UI stands for user experience and user interface. And right now I am videoed. My video is appearing in what was the standard user interface for the first iPods that were developed by Apple. And so as you can see, user interface, it's maybe something that we don't think about a lot as being a huge part of the development of technologies and the ways that we think about what technologies and different devices and different programs can do. But it really does have a lot to do with influencing how those technologies are actually developed and what we can think about in terms of what is possible. So right now you see I'm demonstrating one of the limits of the original interface design for the iPods, and that was the fact that without a touchscreen, and so this was before they developed touchscreen technology, without that touchscreen, you were using a lot of the area of your device and a lot of the visual range and visual part of that device to control it. And without a touchscreen, that was the only thing that you could see. So whereas now we are using touchscreens, all those controls and those interfaces and the buttons and the menus, and that's all integrated as part of the device and as part of the visual that we're interacting with. But before touchscreens were developed, you had to work with the interface being part of the hardware, and as you can see here, it was a really big part of the hardware, and it really limited the size of the screens. And this, I think, was a big limiting factor for the different technologies that were originally developed for iPods. So iPods, they were made to play music, and I think that until they were able to expand the screen and develop a set of controls and the technology to actually integrate the user experience and the user interface with the video itself and the display itself, they were really limited in terms of what they could do and the types of apps that were going to be developed for these devices. So the iPod was primarily used to play music, but can you imagine if this had been what was originally trying to sell video chat and FaceTime, or if this was something that you were trying to play a game on? Other than Snake. Maybe some people remember what that game was, but that was a fun little video game that I used to play on my Nokia, and it was limited to a screen about this size. And so you can see here, just with my video, how limiting this screen size was because the controls and the screens themselves had to be separate. So this is something that has really evolved, even in just the past. Let's see here, the first touchscreen device, the first iPhone was released in 2008. And so it has only been about 10 years since user experience and user interface has become a really big field in terms of design and visual design and development of these visual technologies, but it's also become a part of the development of these apps themselves. So, and that comes down to working with games, working with any kind of app program, and thinking about how people interface with that app. So what we have here is just some examples. So, oh look, now I'm in it's still the first iPhone, so this is 10 years old, but you can see just how much more space there was for the apps to actually, and the technology to progress and to develop, and there was so much more space for the users to interact with apps once these touchscreens were developed and once these user interfaces became a part of the product. So that's another thing to think about as well when you're working with a standard set of controls such as a keyboard or a mouse. And this was really different with things like the websites, because then people were still interacting with the screen of the website, and that was going to be the user interface. But as soon as touchscreens were developed for the iPhone originally, and then later on Android phones, once those were developed, suddenly you have all these app developers who are having to really think about the user experience and the user interface, because they're not relying on a certain set of hardware or a more established set of controls from Apple, but they're all, each of these different developers, so anyone developing a photo app, or anyone developing any kind of video app, or anyone developing any kind of game, or the millions of apps that are available, they were also having to think about the controls that the user was going to be working with. And so it's an interesting little double-edged sword where you no longer have a standard set of controls, so you're giving these app developers a lot more, let's see here, you're giving them a lot more agency and a lot more freedom to explore and to really build out interesting user interfaces. The flip side of that is that there's a lot of ways to really mess up interfaces, and you can have an app that is an amazing idea, but if the user has a bad experience with that app, if you haven't figured out the way to create an interface that is intuitive and is easy to use, no matter how great that idea is, it's never going to take off as an app. And so it's something that any app developer, any person who's trying to push any kind of mobile product, it's something that they really have to think about. So that's why I want to include it as part of this class as well. So we're going to be working with vector editors to work with some of the ideas behind wireframes and UX UI design. And so wireframes and concept maps are something that you can use Illustrator to create. And it's something that I do work with, and I do web design, and I do work with interface design, and I have designed a couple of apps. Now, once you start getting into doing that a little bit more, you're probably going to want to use a specialized software, a more specialized software that's made primarily for UX UI design. And we have another video for this module that talks about those different specialized softwares. But a lot of those softwares and those programs and those tools are working within vector graphics and vector files. So knowing how to do this in Illustrator will make it easier to then adapt and work with those tools that are a little bit more centered around UX UI design. So this is something where you might want to practice first with Illustrator, and it can actually help knowing how to work with vectors and vector files and knowing some of these tools. It definitely translates. Even if you're working with something like SketchUp, which isn't even made by Adobe, there's just the principles of vectors and vector files and the ways that they are manipulated, those are cross-platform. So working with Illustrator and practicing these more basic techniques in Illustrator, it then makes it easier to transfer that information and some of those principles into a more focused user experience or user interface building program. So right now, SketchUp is definitely the one that's used a lot. And then Adobe, I think, just launched the non-beta version of Experience Designs, and I think it's Adobe XD. I haven't had a chance to check that out yet, so hopefully that will be integrated more into this course soon. So anyway, but let's talk about Illustrator very quickly, just from this introduction, and then make sure to read the exercise specifics for all the different requirements. But I'm going to be showing a couple of examples of what I'm talking about when I'm using these terms. So what you see here, this is a concept map, and this is something that you can use to first design the way a user is going to navigate a website or an app. And this is really just about the flow of ideas and the flow of information. So, and you can use these for a lot of other applications, not just like digital apps, but like applications. Like you'll see these used when people are thinking about complex problems. You'll see these used a lot in different disciplines. So I tend to, there are also some programs that you can use to create concept maps, but sometimes I do this just straight in Illustrator, and you can see how this would be something that would be conducive to working in Illustrator. You have text, you have these different very simple shapes and lines, and this is all things that you can do using Illustrator. So I want to show these examples, and so these are these more basic ways to start planning out different UX UI designs. So some of these are examples of these, and this is what people call wireframes. So you don't have a lot of concern about color being shown. You don't have any specifics in terms of the names of the artists, names of albums. You don't have any artwork. You're really just seeing the general layout of the screen and then the way that the different areas of information are separated. And then you also see a spot where this is saying, for instance, where under on the image on the right, you have that little circle under artist, and so you're saying, okay, well that could be where someone's face is, and then you have that little music note icon, so that means that there's going to be an icon here or some kind of artwork. But none of that's even filled in yet. And so this is a great place to start, and this is where you always want to start when you're developing UX UI designs. And this is something that you can very easily do in Illustrator. And then also, as you start venturing into more UX UI focused digital tools such as SketchUp or XD, they'll even have things like these little these little boxes and these little icons that denote, oh, this is where this would be a graphic or this would be a block of text. They actually have these already created. But we're not going to do that quite yet. And I do want people to get practice just understanding how you can make these very quickly with basic shapes, even just using grayscales in Illustrator. And then you start to see slightly more advanced wireframes. There's the use of color, but that's mostly used to show how the user is going to be interacting, and it's mostly just being used to highlight. Still, you're just looking at white and black and maybe some grayscale, very simple icons, nothing finalized yet, but this is just to get an idea of the layout and the way that the different information is going to be organized on the screen. So these all fit different screen dimensions, and that's a really important thing to start with when you're working on wireframes even, because that is something that you know is going to be standard. So instead of having standardized hardware where you're working with a set of controls that are standard, now the biggest limiting factor, or the only limiting factor outside of the technology and what it can do, is just the size of a screen on different devices. So that is going to be a big part of this upcoming exercise. And even when you're working with wireframes and you're just starting to do these layouts, even though they're very simple, that is one thing that you want to be working within and be very specific about right off the bat, is that initial size of those dimensions. And then this is kind of the next step in wireframes. A couple more images that are thrown in there. Still not really a big concern on color yet, and using just a few more colors, and then still just black and white and grayscale. And so these are more finished and polished designs, and this is what we're going to be working towards for these exercises. So keep in mind, I'm not expecting people to be able to master this right away. So the exercise and the requirements are going to be very specific about what we're looking for these first explorations into UX and UI design. And I'm just showing these examples in order to show people what is possible when you are working with Illustrator. So Illustrator and vector programs, as you get even the ones that are more focused with UX UI designs, they're not going to actually be able to implement any of the functionality. So none of these buttons are going to work. They're not going to be able to play video. They're not going to be able to actually play the sounds, but you're able to get a really good sense of the way that the user is interacting with these different apps just from these visuals. And these are things that you are going to be able to do in Illustrator and with other vector programs. And as you get to more advanced UX UI centered programs, they even give you kind of pre-set up templates where you can drop your screens and the designs that you make for a new app, or you're trying to revamp an existing interface design. They actually have these templates of like, oh, here's like a bunch of iPhone 7s, and then you can just drop in the graphics, and then they'll put in all like the shadows and all of the like highlights and stuff. So there are a lot of ways to be able to integrate these and show these like on the devices themselves, which are really interesting. And again, just more polished UX UI designs. And this is something that a lot of people work with when they're first working on UX UI designs, is they'll take an existing design and then develop it and create changes to it. And so that's going to be a part of this exercise, is just looking at some of these aspects of these known designs and then trying to recreate them, and then also trying to push them or change them in a different way. All right, so make sure to read the project specifics, the exercise specifics on Canvas, and have a great time with this UX UI exercise.